Hello, students of European history, and welcome once again to another lecture. This one is second one after the beginning of Unit 8, and we're talking about Western Europe after World War II. You might remember that after World War II, Europe is divided into two different zones, more or less, a capitalist and democratic zone, and then also a planned economy or communist dictatorship zone. When we talk about Western Europe, I'm going to be dealing with all of these topics. You can either write them down now or you can wait until you have some space later. But I'll be talking about the reconstruction of Western Europe after World War II, the creation of social welfare states, also the beginnings of multicultural societies in Western Europe, and then some protests that occurs in the 1960s, 1970s, a little bit of an economic slowdown that happens in the 1970s, and then a kind of terrorism that you may not be really particularly familiar with, something that was going on in the 1970s and 1980s. Let's begin with the reconstruction of Western Europe after World War II. Obviously, many of the parts of Europe which had seen actual fighting or were terribly damaged, and these areas needed to be reconstructed. They needed to be rebuilt. And as I mentioned before, there was something called the Marshall Plan, which was to provide $12 billion worth of help to any country in total, any country that required some sort of monetary help in rebuilding. And this was, once again, a very successful program. Also, there were, after World War II, a resurgence of what used to be called Christian socialist parties, perhaps in Austria and places like that, but Christian democratic style parties. This would be kind of the successors to the old Center Party in Germany, maybe something not quite so extreme right wing in France, and so on. But a Christian democratic style party, which is both supportive of democracy, but then also supportive of the social welfare states. Because of the Marshall Plan, because of the rebuilding, and because all of the various political parties seem to be working together to try to make this happen, there are a number of economic miracles that happened after World War II, which that the states get back on their feet, and then they are having economic booms, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s. With that, you have a very rapid increase in the standard of living and consumerism, people being able to buy all kinds of products, makes people very happy. The miseries of World War II or the miseries of the Great Depression that preceded it are forgotten, and many people who were born after 1945 never knew the hard times and only knew the good times of Reconstruction Western Europe. Couple of a photograph of somebody rebuilding, with help from the Marshall Plan. But then also, I think this is an interesting graph and map on the right side of the screen. It shows various states and how much money or how much aid the United States was providing to those various places. And of course, the biggies like the United Kingdom and France make sense. But then if you look fairly carefully, some of these states don't really seem to make a whole heck of a lot of sense in the amount of money that they're getting. You can also note that some of those states, like Sweden, it would be a neutral state. Even Yugoslavia gets some money as well. We'll talk about Yugoslavia coming up in the next couple of weeks. Not necessarily belonging to NATO or not necessarily allied with the United States, and yet really any state can get Marshall Plan aid. Poland and Czechoslovakia both wanted to adopt Marshall Plans, and the Soviet Union simply told them no. It had to do with the part of the Marshall Plan that requires that states come up with an economic plan that aligns with its neighbors and basically agree to be capitalist. And of course, the Soviet Union wasn't going to let that happen. Well, throughout this class, really starting with the Industrial Revolution, we've looked at the social question, what do you do with the poor? And we might go back to remembering liberalism or classical liberalism, which was really kind of spirited towards the poor, and then liberalism changes over time to be really quite supportive of the poor. And it really has its highest point, I think, after World War II with the creation of social welfare states. And so these are the kinds of things that provide aid, help people who are of limited means, or even just people of average means, middle class people. Things like unemployment insurance, a required amount of paid vacation every year, very good wages or healthy pay, health insurance provided to everyone for a price, housing allowances or housing subsidies, and also even payments for people having children. Every single child you have means that every month you get a certain amount of money just to help raise that kid. Now, these social welfare states are paid for, obviously, by higher taxes on the wealthy, progressive taxes. Everyone is paying a higher tax rate in Europe. They're getting much more out of it, let's say. And also, if you have very high taxes on the wealthy, it is, in general, just lessening the gap between the classes, as the wealthy are it's kind of like a Robin Hood principle, where the wealthy are having a lot of their income taken, and then it is being given out to poorer people in various kinds of social welfare ways. Education throughout Europe is compulsory and free, and that's a change from, let's say, the 19th century. And typically what you see happening is that the more wealthy a state is, oftentimes the more geographically northern that state is, there is more intervention in people's lives and more intervention in the social question. In other words, the wealthier states tend to take care of their people better than maybe the southern states that really quite aren't so well. There's also the woman question, if you remember, and obviously women wanted to improve the lives of other women for much of the 19th century, and then of course there's the question of suffrage as well. After World War II, there was a baby boom that occurred. This could be, pent-up demand, so to speak, from the war period when men and women were oftentimes separated from one another. But it could also have to do with the social welfare state and people generally feeling comfortable having as many kids as they wanted to within reason, because they knew that there was always going to be help available, free medical care and education and those sorts of things. And so people feeling very comfortable with that, had a number of children. Later, really starting in, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s, there is a baby bust, or people having fewer kids on average. Maybe this has to do with consumerism after people became really quite comfortable with the amount of things that they could purchase, the vacations that they could have, the automobiles that they had, the apartments or houses that they had, that it occurred to them that children were very expensive in spite of the social welfare state, and every additional kid that they had brought their standard of living down. And so people started to choose in Europe to have fewer kids per family or on average. It also was really quite helpful in 1961 when the birth control pill was developed, and within a few years the birth control pill can be gotten not just by married women, which was the rule at first, but by any woman, and this helps women deal with unplanned pregnancies or regulating their pregnancies. Women at this point in time, because they are no longer spending their entire lives having babies or being stuck in the second sphere, women are starting to feel more and more like they are more than just mothers. Once again, the replacement rate for people is that every woman on average should have an average of 2.1 births, and it's starting in, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s. The birth rate in Europe fell under that. And so women could start to, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, start to have the same educational opportunities due to the welfare state, eventually the same white-collar work opportunities that men had. And although men and women are still not quite equal, I'm sure you know some of those statistics, you know some of those things about men earning more than women and so on. Um, in general, women have legally the same opportunities that men do, is really starting in, let's say, the 1980s or so. There is, of course, still discrimination. There is still remnants of misogyny and so on. If you look at the top corporations, it's really difficult for women to make it into leadership positions in those top corporations. In Europe, they do a pretty good job of, in many countries, having women leaders. There's been a German chancellor, a female German chancellor, Angela Merkel. There was also a British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and some of the smaller countries also have women leaders from time to time. Another problem is the double burden that women face. In other words, that women, now that they can work and be equal to men, when they come home from a hard day of work, both a man and a woman in a double income family, oftentimes the woman is still responsible for the cooking and the cleaning and so on. Or when children are born, it's usually not asked of the man whether he's staying home or not. It's usually asked of the woman whether she's staying at home or not. There was a book written in 1949 by Simone Beauvoir, and this book is called The Second Sex, and it more or less repeats what you and I already know about European history, that women forever were considered to be a kind of second-class person and didn't have the same opportunities that men did. Of course, Simone Beauvoir, as a woman and also a feminist, would advocate for men and women having completely equal rights. After World War II, there was a kind of change. Before World War II, for much of Europe's history, really starting in the 19th century for the most part, Europeans were going all over the world. They were immigrating to the United States or to South America or to Australia and Canada and so on. After 1945, and especially after, let's say, 1950 or so, there are a large number of people who are immigrating to Europe from other places, people from Turkey, Southern Europeans moving within Europe, up to Germany, for example, people from Britain's colonies or former colonies moving to Britain, North Africans going to France, Indonesians who had been controlled by the Dutch or by the Netherlands moving to the Netherlands. Part of the reason for this is that the economies in Western Europe that are booming in the 1950s, 1960s need workers. There's a shortage of some men due to the war. And so the economic miracle economies do need some workers, and these people are coming to fill, somewhat sadly, they're filling the lowest roles in the economy. But as Europeans get, let's say, better jobs, better educated and so on, they need somebody to do their dirty work. Starting in the 1970s, as I'll tell you again and again, really starting about 1973, there is a slowdown in these miracle economies, and then numbers of immigrants are not needed. In fact, some Europeans want the immigrants to go home at that point in time, which is not something that happens. Because you have people coming from countries that weren't Christian, people of color, and so on, you have the creation of multicultural societies. As I just mentioned, the immigrants often do the worst jobs or the first people who are let go or unemployed. They are non-Christian people. They are people of color oftentimes. And at first, they have difficulty in assimilating. They speak a different language oftentimes. They have a different religion. They have a different race. And Europe is not like the United States, for example, a kind of melting pot society where new waves of people are readily accepted. And so this is really quite a change after 1950 or so in Europe, for the first time having fairly large numbers of people of different races and different religions that are living among the Europeans. There is also a kind of cultural division that happens with the immigrants who do move there, that the mothers and fathers of the first generation still are kind of living in their own countries, in their minds, and the kids that they have, they want them to be like the kids from wherever they came from, and yet the kids of that second generation born in West Germany or born in France or born in Britain. They are experiencing, a completely different world, and there's a bit of a culture clash that goes on as the kids who are born in these countries are different than their parents, and oftentimes are not really considered to be fully equal citizens of those countries or of those societies, and yet when they go back to where their parents came from, they're really quite different from the people back in Turkey or back in Pakistan or back in India or wherever it happens to be. So a lot of these people of the second or third generation are kind of stuck between cultures. There's also, because this is relatively new, especially in times of economic stress, there's xenophobia or fear or hatred of others. There are even xenophobic political parties or anti-foreigner political parties that develop, and far right-wing parties or just in general right-wing parties anti-immigrant and try to keep large numbers of immigrants out of Europe. Here are some photographs that might have something to do with immigration at this point in time. Well, let's buzz through some of the countries, and I'll give you some key points that are going on in West Germany and Britain and France and Italy and so on. West Germany, as 3/4 of Germany, let's say, has a kind of reconciliation with Europe. Obviously, Germany had a pretty bad track record in the 20th century, doing horrible things, very aggressive country, and really had a lot of making up with its neighbors to do, let's say. And that does really happen in the 1950s and 1960s. What you can see there on the top right is Konrad Adenauer, who is the Chancellor of West Germany, giving a kind of warm embrace to the leader of France, a man by the name of de Gaulle. What you see also in the kneeling figure is a later German Chancellor who went to Poland. Excuse me. He went to a memorial for the fallen of World War II. In Poland and dropped to his knees and excuse me, in a kind of gesture of the Germans are sorry for what they did to the Poles, and the Germans were very impressed by that, and the Germans were very shocked that he did that kind of spontaneously. The Poles were maybe less excited about it because instead of falling to his knees at the monument for Polish victims of World War II, it was he fell to his knees at the Polish Jewish victims of World War II, and the Poles are a little bit anti-Semitic and still after World War II, and so didn't make them super happy. Something that happens in 1955, which was really quite controversial both inside Germany and, of course, outside Germany, is that Germany was rearmed. It did not have an army up until 1955. It didn't even really have a government until 1949. And as the United States gets involved in Korea and spends a lot of money defending South Korea from North Korea, the United States asks itself, well, why are we protecting the Germans and not, giving them guns and tanks so that they could perhaps resist a Soviet bloc invasion of their own country? And the answer to that question, quite frankly, is the Germans had been rather naughty. Every time that they had weapons in the 20th century, it seems like they were invading somebody. So very controversial, and yet it's overcome, and the Germans are rearmed in 1955. Finally, there's something called Ostpolitik or East politics. You might remember Realpolitik, the politics of reality. Eastpolitik, Ostpolitik, is a kind of détente, a kind of warming of relationships between West Germany and, in particular, East Germany, becoming more friendly, recognizing its existence and trading with East Germany, but also recognizing the borders between the Germanys and Poland, and it's trying to be kind of friendly, trying to reduce tensions between West Germany and any other country in Eastern Europe. It's really quite successful. Britain after World War II is really all about the creation of a social welfare state. The Labour Party campaigned on this and defeated Winston Churchill at the very end of the war, while the war was still going on, with the idea of a cradle to the grave social welfare state. So a lot of British industries, like the coal industry and the transportation network of rail and so on, were nationalized. They're taken over by the government. Of course, investors are paid for that. People are given comprehensive health insurance. People are given unemployment insurance and so on. This truly is a very all-encompassing social welfare state that takes care of people really quite nicely. Another thing that was going on that we'll talk about towards the end of the year too is the decolonization of really the entire British Empire, but the most important part of the British Empire of India. And this occurs in 1947, also under Labour leadership. It doesn't go particularly well. The British aren't interested in kind of hanging out and keeping different kinds of people in India from killing each other. And so it turns into kind of a mess, but Britain does get out or quit India in 1947. There's a lot of trade and there's a lot of connections that still go on between the two nations. Yet that is what happens. As I said, in the 1970s, there's an economic slowdown. Because of that, perhaps late 1970s, 1979, there is the election of a conservative woman by the name of Margaret Thatcher. Her nickname is the Iron Lady. She comes into power, promising to reduce the social welfare state. There's a lot of controversy over that, with coal miners being let go and coal mines being shut down. They were not particularly efficient. They weren't really making money, and so the government wanted to end that. Of course, it puts people out of work, and since the government owns those coal mines, it's the government's decision. There was a coal miners' strike. A lot of people are really angry with Margaret Thatcher, and her popularity plummets. Luckily for Thatcher, there was a war, which was really kind of unusual, but nonetheless it happened, in 1982 between Argentina, the South American country, and Britain. And believe it or not, Argentina seized some British territory, the Falkland Islands, in South America, off of the coast of South America, and the two nations fought a naval war over these islands. That rallies the British people around Britain, around the flag, and around Margaret Thatcher, and the war is successfully concluded with a defeat of Argentina and a win by Britain. This keeps her going really into the late 1980s as British Prime Minister. In France, France, of course, defeated in World War II, but then on the winning side at the end of World War II, France leads what becomes the beginnings of economic unity in Europe. It leads the common market. Really, France leads the continent. The leader of France over time is Charles de Gaulle, the wartime leader in exile of the Free French forces. He's got a bit of a Napoleon complex, and what I mean by that is he doesn't want to recognize that France is not, the France of 1805 or 1810 anymore. It isn't really qualified to lead all of Europe, and yet de Gaulle wants that to be the case. They joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the headquarters of NATO is in Paris, yet de Gaulle did not want French troops under the command of NATO, and in fact eventually kicks NATO out of Paris. NATO moves then to Brussels, or the headquarters of NATO moves to Brussels. Charles de Gaulle also wanted to not just be protected by the United States nuclear weapons, wanted to have nuclear weapons for France, and so there is a nuclear force that the French control as well. I don't know who the French would be nuking that the United States wouldn't have already have nuked, but so be it. It makes the French feel pretty good. Same thing happens in Britain. The British have a nuclear force as well. I'm going to tell you that France was maybe a little bit more reluctant to give up its colonies than Britain was. Britain does fight some colonial wars as well, but France fights a couple of colonial wars. One of them is in Vietnam, before the United States gets involved in Vietnam, and then one is also in Algeria. The Vietnam War for the French is one that they are willing eventually to give up on. The Algerian War is a much stickier problem, and the reason for that is because there are so many French people who had moved to Algeria since the French had seized it way back in 1820 under the leadership of Charles X. Was that 1820 or 1830? 1830, excuse me. The Algerian War is a huge sticky wicket for the French, and maybe I talk about that in here in just a second. Let me check real quick. Nope, I don't. So I better go ahead and tell you right now. I think I talk about it too when we talk about decolonization, but maybe I'll just leave it for that. Just know that there was a kind of long and bitter war between France and Algeria. And spoiler, France loses, the Algerians win, and 1 million white people who had roots in France moved back to France, and they take a very large number of their allied Arab or Berber citizens of Algeria with them back to France. And France really starts to have, around this period of time, a very large Muslim population of North Africans. There's also a revolution that happens in May of 1968. I'll talk about that coming up here in just a little bit too. This revolution is a revolution of the working class and young people that are allied together. Italy had a monarch. You might remember that. I know we talked a heck of a lot about Mussolini and Mussolini coming into power, and then the monarchy is not very important, I think, in fascist Italy. But because they had been tainted with allowing Mussolini to get in power after World War II in 1946, there was a vote to see if they wanted to keep the monarchs of Italy, the monarchs, and they voted no. So Italy becomes a republic in 1946. Italy always had a kind of long or wide political spectrum that continues into the after World War II period, with very strong communist and socialist movements, lots of coalitions, even far right-wing parties, even sort of neo-fascist parties existed in Italy as well. Italy experiences an economic miracle. I could have told you the same things for France and Britain, but I think it's really kind of miraculous because Italy always had such a poor economy up to that point in time. They also gained a social welfare net. They perhaps made it too generous and for many, many years spent way too much money on the social welfare net, or way too much for their means, so to speak. The nation wasn't particularly rich, and yet it was spending all of this money and would oftentimes deflate its currency to overcome their problem. Italy also experiences some terrorism, some communist terrorism. Italy has always experienced political corruption and really hasn't been well run very often. And as I noted, there's a long or a wide left-right spectrum. Let me go ahead and continue with some West European developments after 1960. There is a new kind of revolution that we had never seen before, a youth revolution. As I said, there's some protest that goes on. There's also that economic slowdown that I keep mentioning, welfare state, and terrorism as well. The protests in the 1960s had to do with a kind of different protest that we'd ever seen before. Oftentimes protests in the 19th century were about, giving the working class their fair share, or getting the vote, or, moving towards communism and those sorts of things. The protest of the late 1960s is, believe it or not, against comfort or materialism. People who had been born after World War II never knew the stresses and strains, economically speaking, of their parents during the war or during the Great Depression, so they'd always had kind of happy, good lives. Their parents were really into things, material things, having a car, having vacations, having a nice place to live, and this young generation doesn't really understand that. And oftentimes, generations go against what the previous generation was all about. And so young people turned against materialism. They also turned against imperialism, which was something that maybe their grandparents or great-grandparents were really into, 1890s, 1900. The imperialism that they are looking at in the 1960s is American imperialism. The Vietnam War for many European people is the United States trying to control the fortunes of a kind of victim country, Vietnam, and it appears to Europeans to be a kind of imperialism redo that they used to be doing. And so they support the Vietnamese in the war. There's also a revolt against conservatism in all of its forms. They want to change things. They don't want to live in kind of a stuffy, conservative, very moralistic society. They want to change things and dream of a Europe or a world that is really quite different. They feared in many respects what the French called métro boulot dodo, or riding on the metro to work, working all day, that's the boulot, and then going home and sleeping at night, that's the dodo. Day after day after day, almost like Groundhog Day, you go to work, you go home, you go to sleep. It seemed like a kind of very unexciting, unappealing, dead end life to a lot of young people. And so they sought escapism, they sought freedom through free sex or much more sexual activity, sometimes escaping with different kinds of drugs, sometimes escaping with rock and roll music. So it really does come down to kind of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then the late 1960s, moving on to the 70s, and this does really have an effect on Europe. It becomes a far less conservative, socially speaking, place, and becomes a much more liberal place where many different kinds of lifestyles and people are accepted. In Paris in May of 1968, there is a protest. As I said, it is a combination of workers and young people from the universities. The workers are dissatisfied with their material lives or with the amount of money that they're making and the number of hours that they are working. The students, on the other hand, are a bit more idealistic, and yet they're really complaining about the conservative nature of their universities, that their classes are overcrowded, and that their professors are very stuffy. And so both these forces join together, which is kind of an unusual alliance. Usually workers feel like the intellectual class of students are little princes and princesses who've never done an honest day's work in their life and are spoiled, and the people who go to college look at the workers as if they are kind of Neanderthals or just workers who don't know anything. But they team up, they protest against the government. Charles de Gaulle is really quite freaked out. He actually flees to French bases in West Germany and is set to invade France with French troops from those bases in West Germany. Instead, though, he calls for new elections and he promises the workers higher wages and better working conditions. And this revolution in May of 1968 kind of falls apart. But as you can see, there's a lot of destruction. There's a lot of kind of street rioting and so on. So it's really a big deal. And it is the beginning of the end of conservative Europe. And after of May 1968, really a number of things changed in terms of women's rights and rights for homosexuals and just creating a much more open and liberal society everywhere. And really a lot of nations in Western Europe had these kinds of protests, and the United States too had a lot of protests in the late 1960s in a very similar way. That economic slowdown that I keep mentioning happens in the 1970s. It happened due to an energy crisis. The oil-producing cartel OPEC increased its oil price dramatically in response to the United States and Western Europe supporting Israel in an Arab-Israeli war. The Arab states that control OPEC wondered why they were, selling to people who were supporting their enemy oil for such a cheap price. The cost of oil goes up, or the cost of energy goes up, and the world economy really slows down. There's lowered growth rates, there's higher unemployment, the welfare state and the amount of money that European workers were making was already really pretty expensive compared to the rest of the world, and this really puts a drag on the European economy. Part of the reason then that there is even more economic unity in the 1970s and beyond is because of this. European states start to band together to try to have a kind of common economic interest so that they can better compete with the rest of the world. And that's what the European Union is all about. And we'll talk about how the European Union gets established, going back to its very early times in a future lecture. Some of the protests that goes on in the 1980s was really quite new. Almost seems like a harkening back to Romanticism in a way. There were people who became very interested in the environment and Once again, this had really never been a concern before. People were really just concerned with economic growth and having jobs. But as industry becomes really damaging towards the environment, people started to realize that the planet seems to be dying, and they formed green parties, or parties that are environmental in nature. And so they reacted to pollution, they reacted to air pollution, they reacted to nuclear power, and we're protesting all of those things and trying to clean up the planet and reduce the chance of war. Nuclear weapons, which are part of the Cold War, and revived Cold War rhetoric that happens in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I'll talk about that later. Really encourages a lot of European people to think about peace and to protest against President Reagan of the United States, who is a practitioner of Cold War rhetoric, or uses Cold War rhetoric quite often, and kind of ramps up the rhetoric or rhetorical hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union. People don't like that very much. They have a kind of peace movement that goes along with the green or the environmental movement as well. The terrorism that exists, really starting in the 1970s, is either nationalist or communist in nature. And just some of the main terrorist groups at this point in time would be the ETA, or the Basque separatist movement in Spain. The Basque region is a little bit different than the rest of Spain, and they wanted to have autonomy or separation. So they engaged in a campaign of terrorism in order to get that. Britain in Northern Ireland had the Irish Republican Army, Catholic people who wanted to join the rest of the Irish Republic instead of having part of the island of Ireland to be part of Britain. There's a lot of fighting that goes on between Northern Irish Protestants and Northern Irish Catholics. The British military gets involved as well, and it's a nasty kind of fight that happens for quite a long time. In West Germany, there's the Red Army Fraction. This is a group of radical communists who are supported by East Germany, who engage in different kinds of terrorism. In Italy, there's also a communist group called the Red Brigades. And all of these terrorist groups commit acts of terror, assassinations and bombings and kidnappings and hijackings of airplanes and things like that. And of course, the states react with counter violence. More recently, there has been those sorts of problems get solved with the end of communism, or nationalism maybe not being quite such a pressing topic in much of Western Europe. And recently, of course, there's been radical Islamic terrorism that happens. Some of the old symbols there's the Red Army Fraction, RAF. That person on the house is from a Catholic neighborhood in Northern Ireland. The Red Brigade, and then the ETA, of course, that's the Basque Freedom Movement, or the Basque Terrorist Organization. Well, modern Western Europe really is kind of a story of an incredible recovery from World War II. It is a completely new start in domestic affairs with the creation of social welfare states. It is really quite amazing in the way that Western European states were no longer competing with each other to try to be top dog, like we had seen going on from the very beginning of this class all the way up until World War II. There's a kind of unification under NATO, or unification under democratic capitalist countries, and you have these old hatreds between, let's say, the Germans and the French, or whoever it might be, disappearing or really going down so much that it's really quite incredible. This had never really happened before 1945. And the people of Western Europe are leading better lives for the most part. Of course, better lives, that's great. People get used to whatever it is that they have, and they always want more. And so protest happens, and terror happens, of course, because not everybody is completely satisfied with their lot in life. There are some economic issues to be resolved as well. In terms of the European Union, we'll talk about this later, there are the pigs, that's Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, these southern European states that maybe aren't quite as economically advanced as some of the northern states, and they tend to get themselves into to spending too much money or spending beyond their means in support of their social welfare state. But that's pretty much it for today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I look forward to lecturing to you again. Please do the reading and do the reading quiz. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.